All right, welcome to another deep dive. This time, we're going to be tackling a pretty big topic.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a really foundational concept in philosophy, especially when we're talking about logic. That concept is logical consequence. And since you're a philosopher, we really want to, explore this, in a way that'll really get you thinking.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? Like this simple question, what makes an argument good? It leads to this really huge, complex topic.
Totally. And to kind of, guide our deep dive today, we're going to be looking at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on logical consequence. So let's go back to that question, that basic question. What makes a good argument good?
So, at the most basic level, a good argument has a conclusion that follows from its premises. It just undeniably follows, that's where logical consequence comes in. It's like the glue that holds a good argument together.
Okay, so it's not just about having premises and a conclusion, right? There has to be this special connection between them.
Yeah.
The conclusion has to flow naturally from the premises.
Exactly. Now, the encyclopedia entry points out that there are different types of arguments, and they each have their own way of, creating that connection. And the two main types, well, they're deductive and inductive arguments.
Yeah, the classic duo. Could you remind us what the big difference is between these two?
Sure. So with a deductive argument, if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. There's no other option. It's like a mathematical proof, That conclusion is a necessary consequence of those premises.
So deductive arguments, they're all about absolute certainty,
Yeah.
guaranteed truth.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, with inductive arguments, it's a little different. The premises, well, they support the conclusion. They make it likely that the conclusion is true, but they don't, absolutely guarantee it.
So there's always a chance, right?
Right.
Even a small chance, but a chance that the conclusion could be false, even if the premises are true. So it's about probability, not absolute necessity.
Right. The encyclopedia entry uses a good example to explain this, the swan example. So, if every swan you've ever seen is white, you might think, okay, all swans are white, right? But there are black swans out there.
Yeah, that's a perfect example of how, inductive reasoning, even though it's often reliable, it can sometimes lead us to wrong conclusions.
Exactly. Now, when we're talking about deductive arguments and logical consequence, well, this idea of necessity, it's super important.
Because the conclusion must follow those premises.
Yeah.
There's just no other way, right?
Right.
But, I remember from my, the philosophy classes, there are actually different types of necessity, right? They aren't all the same.
You're totally right. And, this is where things get really interesting for us philosophers. And the encyclopedia entry, it goes into all these different types of necessity, like metaphysical, conceptual, analytical, a priori. And those can get, pretty complicated.
Yeah, it's like a whole buffet of necessities.
Yeah.
But why is all this so important for understanding logical consequence?
Well, it turns out that just a simple idea of necessity, it isn't enough to really explain what's happening in logical consequence. There's something more to it. And the encyclopedia entry, it calls this formality.
Formality. Okay, now I'm really curious. What does formality have to do with logical consequence?
So imagine this argument. Peter is Greg's mother's brother's son, therefore Peter is Greg's cousin. If that first part is true, that premise, the conclusion, it have to be true, right?
Yeah, I mean, based on how we understand family, yeah.
Yeah.
That seems undeniable.
Exactly. But notice how the truth of this argument, it relies on, what these words mean, Like mother, brother, and cousin. It's not just the structure of the argument. It's also the meanings of those words.
So it seems like we need to find a way to tell the difference between arguments that are true because of the meanings of specific words,
Yeah.
right? And those that are true because of their underlying logical structure, regardless of the specific content.
Exactly. And that's where formality comes in. It's about finding those arguments where the conclusion follows from the premises because of the logical form and not because of what the specific words mean.
So formality, it's like a filter, right? It separates arguments that are true because of logical structure from those that depend on the meanings of those words or, concepts.
Yeah.
But how do we define formality? What actually makes a logical rule or principle formal?
That's a great question. And, there isn't one single answer everyone agrees on. The encyclopedia entry, it lays out 3 perspectives on formality. Each one has its, pluses and minuses. And I think looking at those perspectives, it's really going to help us understand what makes logical consequence so interesting and, so philosophically challenging.
Well, I'm definitely ready to like dive into those perspectives.
Let's do it.
All right, so we're trying to figure out this idea of formality and logic, like what it is, why it's so important, and how all these different philosophers have tried to define it.
Yeah, it's kind of like trying to like grab a shadow or something, right? Like it feels so important, but it's hard to, really pin down what it actually is.
Yeah, it definitely has that kind of like mysterious philosophical vibe.
Yeah.
So let's break down those three perspectives on formality. The ones from the encyclopedia entry. What's that first one again?
So the first perspective, it really focuses on neutrality. So it's like the rules of logic, they have to be totally neutral. They can't like favor any specific object or, meaning.
So logic shouldn't like pick sides,
No.
right? It's all about the form of the argument, not the content. Like
Yeah.
whether we're talking about swans, family members, or even these really abstract mathematical concepts,
Yeah.
those same logical rules, they should still apply.
Exactly. And a good way to understand this whole neutrality thing is through this concept of permutations. That's what Alfred Tarski, the logician, came up with.
Permutations, like rearranging things.
Exactly. Like imagine you have a bunch of objects, right? Let's say apples. And you like shuffle them around. A logical notion, well, it shouldn't change just because you move the apples.
So if we say apple A is red, and then we swap apple A with apple B, the truth of the statement, apple B is red, should depend on, well, whether apple B was already red.
Right.
Not on the fact that it's like in a new spot now.
Yeah, exactly. So it doesn't matter where the apple is. The truth of the statement, it doesn't change just because we move things around. And Tarski, he argued that, true logical notions, they should be like that. They shouldn't change when we do these kinds of permutations.
So it's like a test for logic, right? If an idea can, survive being mixed up without changing whether it's true or false, well, then it's got that formal neutral quality, the one we're looking for.
Exactly. Now, let's think about something like mother of. Okay, so if we say Jane is the mother of Peter, and then we swap them, we get Peter is the mother of Jane. And that just doesn't make sense, right?
Right, because like being a mother, it depends on who Jane and Peter actually are.
Yeah.
It's not just about where they are in some, abstract structure. It changes when you swap things around.
Exactly. And that's why mother of, well, it's not really a purely logical notion, but things like identity or the logical connectives and or they are. Because, whether they're true or false doesn't depend on like the specific things involved.
Okay, so that's neutrality logical rules. They shouldn't care about the specific content. What about the second perspective on formality?
So the second perspective, well, it's all about abstraction. It's like formal rules and logic. They should only focus on the structure of what we're talking about, not the actual content.
So it's like we're looking at a blueprint of a house. We're not worried about the, bricks and wood or who's living inside.
Mhm.
We're just looking at the underlying structure.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. We're interested in how the pieces fit together, how they relate to each other, regardless of what those pieces represent. Like, think about the word and. It doesn't, like, add new information, right? It just combines what's already there.
So if we say like the sky is blue and the grass is green, that and it just connects those two statements. It doesn't like tell us anything new about the color blue or like the idea of grass itself. It's just, doing its thing at that structural level.
Exactly. And this whole idea of focusing on structure, it's super important to formality. Formal logic, it's all about those abstract relationships, those
Yeah.
reasoning patterns that are true no matter what specific content we put into them.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, what about that third perspective on formality? What does that one bring to the table?
So the third perspective, it's especially interesting for philosophers because it connects logic to like the very nature of thought. It's like it sees formal rules of logic as these constitutive norms for thought.
Constitutive norms. Can you explain that a little more?
Sure. So it's like this. These rules, they aren't just, random rules that we made up and decided to follow. They're more like these fundamental principles that, make rational thought possible. They're part of what it means to think in a coherent way.
So it's like those logical rules, they're built into how our minds work,
Right.
right? It's not something we learn from experience. It's what makes, experience and reasoning possible.
Exactly. They're like the basic operating system of our minds, right? And it doesn't matter what we're thinking about, these rules always apply.
So whether I'm, thinking about the meaning of life or just trying to decide what I'm going to have for dinner, those basic logical operations, they're always there shaping my thoughts.
Exactly. And this perspective, well, It really shows how deeply connected logic and rationality are. It's like to think rationally, is to think logically, to follow these basic rules of thought.
Okay, so we've got these three perspectives on formality:
Mhm.
neutrality, abstraction, and constitutive norms. Each one gives us a different way to look at what makes logic, logical.
And, it's worth pointing out these perspectives, they don't have to like totally contradict each other, right? They might even like work together.
Yeah, they're like different sides of the same idea of formality. Each perspective, it shows us a different part of what makes logic so powerful, so, fundamental to how we understand the world.
Absolutely. But now that we've, gone through these basic ideas, I think it's time to get a little more practical. How do logicians actually study logical consequence? Like, what are the tools they use?
That's a great question. I'm ready to see what's in the logician's toolbox.
Yeah.
What are those key instruments that they use to analyze, logical consequence? So we've been, exploring this world of logical consequence, right? Look at all the different types and those complex relationships with like necessity and formality, and even those philosophical perspectives that shape how we even think about this whole concept.
Yeah, and we even like peeked into the logician's toolbox,
Yeah.
right? Talking about those methods they use to really, dig into the nature of logical consequence.
Exactly. We're talking about those cool tools, like model theory and proof theory. Can
Mhm.
you remind us how those work? Like, how are they different?
Sure. So model theory, well, it uses these mathematical structures called models, and those like represent different possible worlds.
So it's like creating these, little mini universes where we can test out different logical statements and see, like, do they actually hold up? Right.
Exactly. A model is like this testing ground for logical claims. And, in model theory, an argument is logically valid only if there's no model, no possible world where the premises are true, but the conclusion is false.
So it's like a cosmic game of find the loophole. If there's no loophole, well, the argument, it passes the test.
Exactly. Now, proof theory, that's a bit different. It's all about building proofs. It's like a step-by-step demonstration showing that an argument is valid.
Hmm.
And, it uses those inference rules.
Okay, so if model theory is about, like, exploring all those possible worlds to see if an argument makes sense, proof theory is about building a bridge, right? Like a chain of reasoning, going from those premises to the conclusion.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It's like following a recipe. A logical recipe where each step, well, it's justified by a rule. And that makes sure that we get to that conclusion in a way that's, logically sound.
And these two approaches, they're different, but they're both, like, seen as valid,
Right.
right? They just offer different ways to understand and demonstrate logical consequence.
Right. They're like two sides of the same coin. Model theory, it's about looking for those counterexamples, those loopholes. And proof theory, it's about building that, valid chain of reasoning.
And these two approaches, they've even like sparked some pretty big philosophical debates, right? The encyclopedia entry, it mentioned something about realism versus anti-realism.
Yeah. So it's a pretty deep philosophical topic. But basically, realists, they tend to like model theory because, it fits with their idea that truth is objective. Like it's out there in the world, whether we like it or not. They see those logical truths as, existing out there waiting for us to discover them. But anti-realists, they often prefer proof theory because it like emphasizes those cognitive processes, like
Yeah.
the rules we follow when we're like building and justifying our beliefs.
So for a realist, logic is about finding those like objective truths, right? The ones that, govern the universe.
Yeah.
And for anti-realists, logic is more about the rules we use to like create and justify our own knowledge.
Exactly. And those philosophical positions, they show us, different ways of thinking about the nature of truth and even logic itself. And well, that debate, it's been going on forever. And it shows how logic is connected to like some of the biggest questions in philosophy.
That's what makes this whole discussion so interesting, right? It's not just about those like dry rules. It's about these big questions that deal with, knowledge, truth, and even reality.
Absolutely. And speaking of those big questions, well, I think it's time to, face the really big one. That question that's been hanging over our whole conversation. Is there just one true logical consequence relation? Or could there be, many?
Ah, yes, the monism versus pluralism
Yeah.
debate. Now we're getting into the really deep philosophical stuff.
We are. So monists, they believe there's only one true logic. It's the ultimate way, that conclusions follow from premises.
So for them, all those different systems we've been talking about,
Yeah.
classical logic, intuitionistic logic, modal logic, all those, they're just different, attempts to capture that one true logic.
Exactly. They see these systems as like pointing towards a single ultimate truth about logical consequence. Like there's this, grand unified theory of logic out there, and we're just trying to, put the pieces together.
Okay, so that's the monistic view, one true logic to, rule them all.
Yeah.
What about the pluralists? What do they think?
The pluralists, well, they're open to the idea that there could be like multiple legitimate ways to, define logical consequence.
So they see the logical landscape as more like, a diverse ecosystem, like a rainforest or something, rather than a single, boring field.
Exactly. They say that, different logical systems, well, they might work better in different situations or for different purposes. What's valid in one system might not be in another, and that's okay.
So instead of looking for that one true logic, they're more interested in like exploring all the different options, right? They
Right.
see that each system, it has its own, strengths and weaknesses.
Yeah, exactly. And this whole pluralist idea, it's become, pretty popular lately, especially since logicians have been exploring all these different non-classical logics.
And I bet this whole debate has some pretty big implications for like how we think about philosophy, right?
Right.
And even about the nature of rationality itself.
Oh, absolutely. If we go with pluralism, well, it might encourage us to be more open-minded, more tolerant of different ways of thinking. We might be more willing to consider, alternative ways of reasoning. And we might realize that there isn't always just one right way to approach a problem.
That's a really cool point. It's like pluralism could lead to this, inclusive way of thinking about knowledge and understanding.
Yeah. But on the other hand, if we stick to that strict monist view, well, it might make us more rigid in our thinking. We might be less willing to even, think about ideas or arguments that don't fit with what we already believe about logic.
It's like, seeing the world in black and white versus appreciating all those, vibrant colors.
Exactly. And I think this whole debate between monism and pluralism, it really shows how logic, at its heart, it's not just about rules and symbols, it's about how we think,
Yeah.
how we reason and make sense of the world around us.
This has been an amazing journey. We've really explored this, intricate world of logical consequence. We've seen all its parts and how it connects to those, big philosophical ideas. And we've even talked about the potential for, both unity and diversity in logic.
Yeah, it's been a real deep dive, hasn't it? We've uncovered some pretty, complex stuff. Even experienced philosophers, they might find some surprises down here.
I agree. And honestly, I think we've only just like scratched the surface. There's so much more to
Mm.
discover, so many more, philosophical paths to explore.
Absolutely. But before we wrap things up, I want to leave you with one last thought, something to think about. Which view of logical consequence, really speaks to you?
Yeah.
Do you like the elegance and simplicity of monism, or do you prefer that richness and diversity of pluralism, or maybe you're somewhere in between?
That's a great question to leave our listeners with. It's one of those questions that doesn't have an easy answer. But, even just thinking about it, exploring those different, perspectives on logical consequence, well, can help us understand philosophy, rationality,
Hmm.
and even, the nature of thought itself.
Exactly. And that's, the beauty of logic. It pushes us to question, to explore, and to always, keep expanding our understanding.
Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive into logical consequence. We hope you've enjoyed it and that you'll, keep exploring this fascinating and thought-provoking area of philosophy.